All right, we are recording. Great, well, hi everyone. My name's Alena Stern, and I'm here today with my colleague Ajjit Narayanan. We're both data scientists at the Urban Institute, and we're here today to talk to you about the Prototype Spatial Equity Tool. Next slide. So first, before we dive into the demo of the tool, I want to provide a bit of background on the context and cities and our motivation for building the tool at the Urban Institute. So one trend that we're seeing across cities is city leadership is making explicit equity promises. Next. For example, in the city of Boston, launching their Resilient Boston first ever strategy for racial equity in 2017. Next. In the city of Austin, creating their equity office that is putting all city departments through a 2-year equity assessment cycle. We're seeing cities take these new strategies to really incorporate a racial equity lens into their work. Next. At the same time, we're really seeing technology transform the way that cities are doing business. In 2017, a survey by the National League of Cities found that 2/3 of US cities had invested in some sort of smart city technology, and that number is only increasing. Next. And so we asked ourselves at the Urban Institute whether these two trends could reinforce each other, whether technology could be a resource to accelerate equity by increasing city efficiency, responsiveness to residents, and making it easier for cities to reach and serve disadvantaged populations. Next. At the same time, there's great potential for technology to exacerbate disparities by accelerating gentrification and displacement, increasing surveillance of communities of color, and exacerbating inequities along the digital divide. Next. One particular potential for technology to exacerbate inequities that we're concerned about is the potential for sort of biased data to be fed into automated decision systems, yielding biased algorithms and biased policy decisions, which could create a sort of a reinforcing cycle for data-driven decision-making to actually reinforce inequities. Next. And so in our research, we've had the opportunity to talk with leaders from a number of different cities. And one thing that we've heard from these folks is that a key to making sure technology is a force to drive equity is really enabling cities to hardwire equity into the way they use data and technology, both through policies and processes that sort of govern the uses of data systems and technologies in city government, as well as by having sort of tools and resources to do rigorous equity analysis as part of the design of any data or technology system. Next. But of course, this is far easier said than done. First, cities lack a standard definition of equity, which makes it difficult to compare results and learn across cities, as well as making it difficult within a single city to have sort of shared buy-in around a sort of commonly understood definition, and for residents to hold leadership accountable for their commitments. Next. In addition, we see a number of data challenges when we think about how to assess the equity impact of these sort of data and technology programs. First, we can often see that the data sources themselves reflect the very inequities that we're trying to counter. One example of this is around resident request data, like 311 data. A number of studies have shown that more privileged, higher income populations tend to utilize these systems more, and as a result are overrepresented in these data. So if cities are using these data to drive responsiveness or understand need, they could be reinforcing these very inequities. In addition, to understand disparate impacts, a lot of cities we talk to find it challenging to collect sort of sufficiently disaggregated data to really understand the disparate impacts of city services on different populations, as well as finding it challenging to identify sort of the time and resource to actually do this rigorous equity analysis. Next. So how can we at the Urban Institute help? We see our role as creating resources to help cities understand, what questions they need to ask when they're designing data and technology programs to really make sure that equity is baked into those programs from the very beginning, as well as giving cities the tools and resources that actually help them answer those equity questions and design more equitable programs. And so with that, I will turn it over to my colleague Ajjit to demo the Spatial Equity Tool.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Alena. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Spatial Equity Tool, which I've had the privilege of working on and developing. So first, we're just going to give kind of a high-level overview of how the tool works, and then we're going to actually jump into a live demo to kind of give you a real-life use case of what you can use the tool for. So first, at a very high level, the tool can take in any kind of CSV dataset with point identifiers. And so what that means is it's usually a CSV dataset with, say, a latitude and a longitude column. It then gets fed into our spatial representation tool, which does some analysis and then spits out two things. It spits out geographic representation metrics, which tell us which neighborhoods in a city are over and underrepresented in the data. And then secondly, it also spits out demographic representation metrics, which tells us which demographic groups generally are over and underrepresented in the data. And so to go into that a little bit further, the tool really works through 6 specific steps. So once a user uploads a data set to our tool, the first thing our tool does is it geocodes that particular data set to a specific city. So let's say, for example, a user uploaded a set of 50 points. What the tool would do is it would first take those points and then geocode them and say, okay, we saw that this data set is from Washington, D.C. And then next, it would then pull the geographic and demographic data for that city. So in this case, we pull all of that geographic and demographic data from the American Community Survey. And specifically, right now, the tool uses the 5-year ACS ending in 2017. But we essentially pull, one, all of the census tracts for that particular city from the American Community Survey, and then a couple of demographic pieces of information about the socioeconomics of every single one of those census tracts. Next, the tool computes which census tract each of the data points that you've uploaded falls into. So in this case, it would simply take every point in your data, find out which census tract it maps into, and then basically get a map like this, where essentially you can see a heat map of where exactly your data set is distributed across a particular city. Next, this is the actual fun stuff. The tool calculates the spatial equity metrics. So to give you an example of how this works, it's probably best to focus in on one specific census tract in a neighborhood. And just for those of you that are unfamiliar, a census tract in a neighborhood is kind of sort of analogous to a particular neighborhood in a city. But assuming we focus on this particular census tract in the upper northwest quadrant of DC, let's say that that particular census tract contains 40% of your entire data set. But according to census figures, that same census tract contains only 10% of the city's population. Then what the tool would do is simply take the difference between those two numbers, or in this case, 30%, and report that as the total overrepresentation of that census tract. In other words, the tool would say that that particular census tract is about 30% overrepresented in your data compared to the city's population. And that's actually an important point, and I want to step back and make, which is that when talking about this tool, how exactly does it measure equity in data? Well, we need some sort of ground truth data set to compare to when we say things like the data set is biased or is inequitable in XYZ way. And in our case, we use the population density from the ACS. So what that means is we're assuming that if your data set is equitable, the data should be distributed roughly in accordance with how the population is distributed in the entire city. And so if there's one particular neighborhood that has a larger proportion of the data than the proportion of the city's population in that tract, we would say that particular tract is overrepresented and vice versa. Now, it is important to note that this is oftentimes an imperfect ground truth and may not be suitable for most data sets, but it is a useful starting point. So with that being said, after we compute the spatial equity metrics, we can get a map of essentially which neighborhoods in a city are overrepresented and underrepresented, and see across our entire city, we have a good map of which particular neighborhoods are over and underrepresented in the data. But then on top of that, we overlay demographic information from the ACS to compute our demographic equity metrics. So the way this works is, again, focusing on that specific tract. Let's say that particular tract contained 40% of the data. And let's say that tract was 50% white. Then we would sum that number. So in this case, 0.4 times 0.5, but do that same calculation for all of the tracts. And we would call that the data implied average. And so what that means is it's essentially calculating the average percentage of white neighborhoods across the data as a whole. And then we do the same calculation, but instead of looking at the percentage of the data coming from each tract, we'd look at the percentage of the population coming from each tract. So in this case, that tract contains 10% of the city's population. It's still 50% white, so now it would be 10% times 50%. We can do that calculation for all of the tracts, and this would be the citywide average, or in other words, the actual average of white neighborhoods across the city at large. And then if we take the difference between the two, which is the data implied white resident average minus the citywide white resident average, we would get our demographic equity metrics specific for white residents. So in this case, we can make a claim that white residents are in general about 10% or X% overrepresented in the data set compared to the city at large. And we can do that same comparison, not just for the percentage of white residents, but for a couple of different socioeconomic variables, including other race shares, the percentage of families with poverty, the percentage of residents with a bachelor's degree or higher, and a couple of other ones I'll get into later. So after doing all of this, after computing our spatial equity metrics and our demographic equity metrics, we finally also assess the statistical significance of our metrics. And so the way we do this is that all census figures essentially come with a measurement error. And so we can append, we can essentially do a set of sampling with those measurement errors and see whether or not the results we've got for our spatial equity metrics and our demographic equity metrics are significant. So in this case, we would say that the percentage of data that comes from a particular census tract is fixed because that's a result of the data set you upload. But the percentage of, say, white residents in a census tract or the percentage of the population that falls in the census tract are census estimates with associated margins of error. So we can resample those values, then recalculate the spatial equity and demographic equity metrics, and then see what percentage of them are above 0 or below 0 and are statistically significant. But that was a lot of talk. Let's just jump into a live demo to give you a flavor of exactly what the tool can currently do. So to test this, we're going to go over to, because we're from DC, we like Open Data DC, which is DC's open data portal. And you can really search for any geographic data set with latitude and longitude points. And in this case, the one I pulled up on the Open Data DC portal is a list of all public Wi-Fi hotspots from the DC government. So you can see they're kind of spread across all of DC. And if you were to hover over them, you can see the name of this particular public Wi-Fi hotspot. But you can do this for pretty much any city in the United States. We currently have data not just for DC, but actually all cities in the United States with populations above 50,000. So that's about 800 cities. So you can go to any city's open data portal and find any geographic data. But after you do, all you have to do is download it as a CSV, or in this case, they call it spreadsheet. Let's save that locally into the downloads folder. And then we can actually go to the front-end interface we currently have built for the app, which is here. At the top, you'll see lots of warnings about how this is pre-release software and not fully released by the Urban Institute. For now, we're going to ignore that and actually start playing with the tool. So the user interface is very simple. All we have is one upload button where you can upload a CSV, and we require that the CSV has 2 columns labeled either longitude and latitude, or long lat, or X and Y. I've opened the CSV before, so I know that it actually has 1 column named longitude and 1 column named latitude, but you should make sure with your particular CSVs. I'm just gonna go ahead and upload it. So let's go to downloads. That's the CSV we just downloaded. We're then going to upload it, and this is going to take a couple of seconds. It's going to send it to the serverless web application we created that's actually going to do the processing and computing, and is actually going to compute both the spatial equity metrics and the demographic equity metrics that we talked about. And then it's going to display it like this. So there are 2 things here. The first thing I'm going to talk about is this map. So this map gives us the geographic representativeness of the data, and it essentially is a map of the spatial equity metrics we talked about. So in this case, if I were to hover over, say, a particular tract, we can see that this is census tract 9. It contains actually 0.00% of the data, or a very small percentage of the data. But it contains 1.6% of the city's population. So our tool calculates that this particular tract is actually about -1% underrepresented. And on the flip side, if you're to go to another tract downtown, let's say census tract 107, that contains 2.5% of the data, but that tract correspondingly contains 0.25% of the city's population, so it's about 2.3% overrepresented. So this gives us a good global picture of exactly which neighborhoods are over and underrepresented in the data compared to the city population at large. And here we can see that a lot of downtown places and some neighborhoods in the south of DC and in the northeast of DC are particularly overrepresented with public Wi-Fi hotspots. And that kind of makes sense because we would think that a lot of downtown spots have public Wi-Fi hotspots. And in fact, if you were to dig more deeply into the data, you'd see that public Wi-Fi hotspots tend to be located where government offices are located. And there are a lot of public police buildings in the south of DC and a lot of citizen centers in the northeast of DC that account for this relative overrepresentation. So that is just, like we said, a map of the geographic representativeness of the data. The next thing we do is we overlay demographic data from the census on top of these tracts. And we can say, okay, what kind of residents actually live in these overrepresented tracts versus the kinds of residents that live in these underrepresented and underserved tracts. And that's how we get this bottom chart. So let me just zoom in a bit. So on the left is a list of a few census variables that we've pre-computed and stored. So these are things like percentage of residents with a bachelor's degree or higher, race shares, the percentage of residents, or the unemployment rate for that particular neighborhood, et cetera. And so if you were to hover over, say, the percentage of residents with a bachelor's degree or higher, we see that bachelor-educated residents are about negative 4.7% underrepresented in the data compared to the city at large. And so what that means is, you scroll up to the map, the areas that are blue tend to have, or the areas that are pink tend to have more residents that have a bachelor's degree than the areas that are blue. And if we were to measure that, it's about 5%. And so again, this just gives us a way of quantifying the level of disparities between the overrepresented and underrepresented areas, and more importantly, a way of imputing demographic information about your data, even if your data set, like in this case, our data set is just a listing of latitudes and longitudes, it doesn't have any demographic data, but we can overlay demographic data from the census and impute what the demographics of your data actually look like. So in this case, we see that public Wi-Fi hotspots tend to be underrepresented in highly educated neighborhoods and in white neighborhoods, and tend to be overrepresented in Black neighborhoods, high poverty neighborhoods, and high unemployment neighborhoods. And again, this is meant to be a starting point for your analysis. So this obviously sparks lots of interesting questions, like why are there so many public Wi-Fi hotspots in these kinds of neighborhoods? Why are they located in these particular areas of the city? And maybe for a city planner, this could help you answer questions like, okay, where should our next Wi-Fi hotspot go if we really wanted to increase equity and give all residents the access and opportunity to access public Wi-Fi? And so that's how we hope people will use the tool. With that being said, I'm going to jump back to the PowerPoint for a couple more slides. Oops, that's from the beginning. So what questions can this tool answer? So we recognize that by releasing a publicly facing tool, we have to be really clear about what questions this tool can answer and what questions this tool can't answer. So as for exactly what questions this tool can answer, basically, if people were to ask questions like, compared to the population distribution in a city, are certain areas of the city over and underrepresented in my data? And are certain demographic groups over and underrepresented in my data? That's the exact kind of question our tool can answer and does a pretty good job at answering. And it can also answer questions about significance. So are these results significant after taking into account variance and census figures? Which actually, if you were to look at the live demo, you can see we've actually grayed out a couple of tracks here, and that's because there wasn't significant geographic bias. And similarly, we have the error bars here, where if the lines or the bars fall within the error bars, that result wasn't statistically significant. And if the lines fall outside the error bars, then that result was statistically significant. So if you have questions about, again, geographic and demographic over and underrepresentation and their statistical significance, our tool can answer those questions. But the kind of questions our tool can't answer are specifically why are certain areas or demographic groups overrepresented in my data? So in this case, you have to do a lot more digging into the data and to uncover that a lot of public Wi-Fi hotspots tend to be located where public government buildings are, and a lot of public government buildings are located in the particular neighborhoods that we saw. Again, this tool can't directly answer that, but it should get you started and get you asking the right questions. But the second question this tool can't answer is whether or not the population distribution is a good measure of the ground truth in our data. So for example, if I was a city official and I wanted to think about the most equitable way to distribute public Wi-Fi hotspots, I might not want to distribute it according to where the population is distributed. I might want to distribute it according to where folks who have the least broadband access are. And those are really the neighborhoods I should target for lots and lots of public Wi-Fi hotspots. So again, depending on the goal of your analysis, depending on exactly what kind of questions you're asking, the population distribution may not actually be a good measure of the ground truth in your data. And then finally, how do we de-bias, or how do we kind of hardwire equity into the data? Let's say we found problems and that particular neighborhoods were underrepresented. What can we do about it? Unrepresented data can actually signify a lot of different problems. So it can signify problems with data collection and reporting. So for example, oftentimes, if you were to look at the example of arrest data, for example, arrests are often concentrated in low-income and minority populations. But that's not because all crime happens in low-income and minority populations. It's oftentimes due to policing patterns, and the data collection and reporting patterns of police officers may be biased against those communities. It could also represent problems with previous policy decisions. So building on that example, it could have been that a previous policy decision led to over-policing and a lot more patrols in these low-income and minority neighborhoods, and that maybe needs to be looked at further and reversed. Finally, it could also signify inaccurate ground truth data. And again, right now, the only ground truth baseline data set we're offering is population distribution, but sometimes that may not be the ground truth data you want to compare your data set to. Maybe you need some other kind of ground truth data set that you actually want to look at the differences for. And obviously a combination of all of the above, which is what it's going to be in most cases. And all of these require different solutions, and all of these are tough to figure out and tough to actually nail down and see what you can do to solve it. But at the very least, we hope our tool will allow people to start asking these kinds of questions and start doing the investigation analysis it requires to answer these hard questions. Finally, I just want to lay out a couple of broad use cases that we see for our tool and how we hope other folks will start using our tool. So one, we think our tool can be used to measure equity in the allocation of local infrastructure, investments, services, and even environmental hazards, like where trash stations are located. So this is, as example, stuff like park locations, where affordable housing is, where building permits are located, trash collection centers, etc. And that it'll just, at a very rough glance, allow you to see which kinds of populations are overserved and underserved by all these different amenities. But second, you can also measure under and over-reporting in resident-generated data, like the 311 data Alena talked about, or even snowplow request data that some cities are making available. And that'll give you a sense of exactly what kind of residents are starting to use these kind of online government services like 311, and which residents are left out in that process. But three, broadly, any kind of geographic point data with latitude and longitude is really the minimum threshold that you need to start using our tool. So if you have any kind of point data that has latitudes and longitudes, and you're thinking, or you have questions about how representative your data set is of the city at large, you can plug it right into our tool and you'll get an answer. So in conclusion, our tool measures the spatial and demographic representativeness of municipal data sets. It compares your uploaded data to ground truth data from the American Community Survey, and specifically uses population densities as the ground truth. And we believe that this kind of tool is the first step to, one, operationalizing equity measures. So as Alena talked about, it's often, the definition of equity in cities varies a lot. And so this is kind of a first step, we think, into operationalizing definitions of equity and getting everyone in the same playing field, so that it becomes easier to measure equity, one, across different cities, but two, across different policy domains and even across time. We also think this is a kind of first step to democratizing data analysis tools for city leaders. So there's been a lot of work done in democratizing data analysis and the growth of open data portals to make sure that everyone has access to the data they need. But we also want to start democratizing simple data analysis tools that allows members of the public and even those with a non-technical background to start asking and answering questions around, let's say, how representative a given data set is, what neighborhoods are left out of the decision-making process and left out of data sets. So we really hope that the audience for this tool is not just city leaders, but also members of the public, nonprofit members and community organizations that work with community members, and even like members of community organizations, and actually members of the city themselves who maybe want to advocate for their particular neighborhoods to have more investment. And so the audience is broad, but we believe it's a first step to democratizing data analysis tools. And so yeah, that's it. That's the end of our presentation. We hope you enjoyed it. And just so you know, and get an idea of what's coming in the future, we do plan on releasing a publicly available version of this tool sometime over the next few months. We're going to be cleaning up the UI, making it a little bit more polished. But when we do release it, we'll let you all know. Thank you so much, and that's the end of our presentation.
Thank you very much.